Get out. We don't serve people like you here." Those words hit me like a slap across the face as I stood in the marble lobby of Heritage Trust Bank clutching my withdrawal slip. The white manager's voice dripped with venom as security guards moved toward me. But what she didn't know was that in exactly 7 minutes, I would own her job, her bank, and her future. My name is Dr. Amelia Richardson, and this is the story of how racist hatred met its perfect match. If you want to see justice served cold, subscribe to Black Stories Box and buckle up for a ride that will restore your faith in karma. Walking into Heritage Trust Bank that Tuesday morning, I should have noticed the immediate shift in atmosphere. The conversations stopped. The smiles faded. Eyes followed me, like I was some kind of threat just for existing in their pristine space. I had driven my modest Honda Civic, instead of my usual Mercedes, wanting to stay low-key for what I was about to do. As a successful neurosurgeon who had just returned from a 6-month sabbatical in Geneva, I was carrying a cashier's check for $50,000, money I planned to withdraw and donate to the community clinic downtown. The moment I approached the teller window, I felt it. That familiar chill that comes with being the only black person in a room full of people who wish you weren't there. The blonde teller, whose nameplate read Jessica Morgan, looked at me like I had just tracked mud across her white carpet. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently against the counter as she waited for me to speak, her blue eyes cold as winter ice. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," I said calmly, sliding my identification and the cashier's check across the marble counter. Jessica's expression shifted from mild annoyance to outright suspicion as she picked up the check like it might bite her. She held it up to the light, turned it over multiple times, and even had the audacity to smell it. The performance was so theatrical that other customers began to notice. Something twisted in my stomach as I watched her examine my legitimate financial document like it was contaminated. This wasn't just poor customer service, this was something deeper, something uglier. I had faced discrimination before in my medical career, subtle comments about affirmative action colleagues questioning my surgical skills, but this felt different. This felt personal and deliberate. "Where did you get this?" Jessica asked loudly, her voice carrying across the lobby. Several heads turned in our direction, and I felt the familiar burn of embarrassment creeping up my neck. But I had spent too many years in operating rooms where life and death decisions couldn't wait for hurt feelings. I straightened my spine and looked her directly in the eye. "It's a legitimate cashier's check from my medical practice settlement," I replied evenly. "I'd like to withdraw the funds today." Jessica's laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the polite murmur of the bank like a knife. She called over her shoulder to someone behind her. "Linda, we've got another suspicious transaction up here." That's when I saw her. Branch manager Linda Foster, a woman whose face immediately reminded me of every teacher who had ever made me feel small, every supervisor who had ever questioned my qualifications. She approached with the confident stride of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. "What seems to be the problem?" Linda asked, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me as if I were invisible or irrelevant. The dismissal was complete and immediate, and in that moment I knew this was about to become much more than a simple banking transaction. This was about to become a reckoning. Linda Foster snatched the cashier's check from Jessica's hands with unnecessary force, her movements sharp and aggressive. She examined it with the same theatrical suspicion, but there was something more calculated in her approach. This woman had done this before. The way she held the check, the exaggerated squinting, the loud comments clearly designed to humiliate me in front of the growing crowd of onlookers, it was a well-rehearsed performance. $50,000, Linda announced loudly, making sure everyone in the lobby could hear, from someone who just walked in off the street. "Does this look legitimate to you, Jessica?" The question was rhetorical, designed to invite others into their judgment of me. I watched as other customers began to whisper among themselves, their eyes darting between me and the check in Linda's hands. A cold realization was settling in my chest. This wasn't random. The way the staff was gathering, the way they seemed to feed off each other's suspicion, the casual cruelty of their comments, this was systemic. This was a pattern they had perfected over years of treating people like me as unwelcome intruders in their pristine banking environment. "Ma'am," Linda continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "we're going to need additional verification for a transaction this large. Can you provide proof of employment, tax returns, bank statements showing where this money originated?" Her demands were absurd. Cashier's checks are considered guaranteed funds as reliable as cash itself. What she was really asking for was proof that someone like me deserved to have this kind of money. I pulled out my medical license, my hospital identification badge, and my business cards. I'm Dr. Amelia Richardson, Chief of Neurosurgery at Metropolitan Medical Center. This is a settlement from my medical practice insurance. The credentials should have ended any questions about my legitimacy, but instead, Linda's expression grew even more skeptical. Anyone can fake business cards these days, she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. Jessica, call security. I think we're dealing with identity theft and check fraud. The escalation was swift and deliberate. Within moments, a large security guard named Marcus Williams appeared, his hand already resting on his radio. The pieces were falling into place too quickly, too smoothly. This wasn't their first rodeo. As Marcus positioned himself between me and the exit, I noticed something else disturbing. The other bank employees weren't just watching, they were enjoying it. A loan officer whose nameplate read Robert Chen had abandoned his desk to join the growing circle of staff members surrounding me. A senior teller named Margaret Thompson was whispering excitedly to another customer, clearly relishing the drama unfolding before them. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't about my check or my credentials. This was about power control and the systematic humiliation of anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of who belonged in their institution. They had created their own little kingdom of prejudice, and I had just walked into the center of it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. During my sabbatical in Geneva, I hadn't just been conducting medical research. I had been quietly working with financial advisors, legal teams, and investment specialists to acquire something that would change everything. The irony was about to become delicious. Standing there, surrounded by their manufactured suspicion, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of escalating the confrontation, I pulled out my phone and stepped slightly away from the group. They probably thought I was calling a lawyer or maybe trying to contact someone to verify my story. They had no idea I was about to set in motion the most perfectly orchestrated reversal of power they had ever witnessed. Dr. Thompson, I said quietly into my phone, it's Amelia. I need you to cancel my 3 o'clock surgery. Something's come up that requires my immediate attention. The call was to my surgical colleague, but it was also the first piece of a carefully planned sequence of events. As I spoke, I watched Linda Foster's face. She was listening intently, probably trying to determine if my phone call was legitimate or part of some elaborate scam. What Linda didn't know was that 6 months ago, I had started receiving complaints from patients and community members about Heritage Trust Bank's discriminatory practices. Elderly Black customers denied basic services despite having accounts for decades. Young Hispanic families rejected for clearly legitimate loans. Small business owners humiliated and turned away based on nothing more than their appearance or accent. The complaints had been so consistent, so detailed, that I realized this wasn't just individual prejudice. It was institutional racism that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. So during my sabbatical, while everyone thought I was simply conducting research at European medical facilities, I had been quietly working with financial advisors and legal teams to purchase a controlling stake in Heritage Trust Bank. The acquisition had cost me nearly $8 million of my own money, but I viewed it as an investment in justice. The purchase had been conducted through multiple shell companies and legal intermediaries, keeping my identity completely secret from everyone except the board of directors. By the time the paperwork was finalized, I owned 68% of Heritage Trust Bank, making me the majority shareholder and effective owner of the very institution that was now trying to humiliate me. As I continued my phone conversation, I watched Linda Foster grow more agitated. She was clearly trying to overhear what I was saying, probably hoping to catch me in some kind of lie or contradiction. Marcus Williams had moved closer, his intimidating presence meant to pressure me into leaving quietly. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not today. And Marcus, I continued into my phone using a name I had just read on the security guard's badge. Please have the board emergency meeting moved up to this afternoon. Yes, tell them it's time to implement the changes we discussed. The confusion on Linda Foster's face was priceless as she tried to process what she was hearing. I ended the call and turned back to face the group of bank employees who had gathered around me like vultures. Their expressions ranged from suspicious to openly hostile, but there was something else creeping in now: uncertainty. They weren't entirely sure what to make of me anymore, and that uncertainty was about to become their undoing. "Now," I said calmly, "shall we continue with my withdrawal transaction?" Linda Foster's face flushed red with renewed anger. The sight of me maintaining my composure, refusing to be intimidated or driven away, seemed to enrage her beyond reason. She was about to escalate this situation in ways that would provide me with all the evidence I needed for what came next. Linda Foster's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped completely. "Listen here," she snarled, stepping closer to me with barely contained rage. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it ends now. Marcus, escort this woman out of my bank immediately. She's trespassing and attempting to commit fraud." The transformation was stunning to witness. Whatever thin veneer of politeness she had been maintaining was gone, replaced by raw, undisguised hostility. Her voice carried across the marble lobby, and I could see other customers beginning to pull out their phones to record what was happening. Good. I wanted witnesses for what came next. Marcus Williams stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over me. "Ma'am, you need to leave now," he said, his hand moving to my arm. But I didn't budge. I had faced down hostile hospital administrators demanding patients' families and life-or-death situations in operating rooms. A racist bank manager and her security guard weren't going to break me. "Before you touch me," I said clearly, my voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations, "I suggest you call your board of directors. Specifically ask for Chairman William Hartford. Tell him Dr. Amelia Richardson is here and ready to proceed with the implementation plan." The name hit Linda Foster like a physical blow. William Hartford had been my classmate at Johns Hopkins Medical School 30 years ago. We had maintained our friendship through decades of professional collaboration, and he had been instrumental in helping me navigate the complex financial arrangements necessary to acquire the bank. The look of recognition and growing fear on Linda's face told me she knew exactly who William Hartford was. "You're lying," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You're just trying to intimidate us with name-dropping. Marcus, remove her now." But Marcus hesitated. Something in my demeanor, the calm certainty in my voice, the way I stood my ground without fear, it was giving him pause. "Jessica," I continued, turning to the teller who had started this whole confrontation, "when you process discrimination complaints, do you file them with corporate headquarters, or do you simply ignore them? Because I have documented evidence of systematic discriminatory practices at this branch dating back 5 years. The color drained from Jessica Morgan's face. She had been so confident in her cruelty just minutes ago, but now she was looking around desperately for support from her colleagues. The mention of documented evidence of corporate oversight, of potential consequences for their actions, it was clearly not something they had considered. Robert Chen, the loan officer who had been enjoying the spectacle, suddenly found urgent paperwork to attend to at his desk. Margaret Thompson, the senior teller who had been whispering excitedly to customers, was now avoiding eye contact entirely. The dynamics in the room were shifting rapidly as the staff began to realize this might not end the way they had expected. But Linda Foster wasn't ready to back down. Years of getting away with discriminatory behavior had made her overconfident, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her professional life. "I don't care who you claim to know," she said, her voice rising to near-shrieking levels. "You come into my bank with your fake credentials, and your threats trying to steal money that doesn't belong to you. Well, it doesn't work that way." And then she did something that sealed her fate forever. She reached across the counter, grabbed my legitimate cashier's check, and tore it in half with vicious satisfaction. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the lobby like a gunshot, and gasps erupted from every corner of the room. The pieces of my $50,000 check fluttered to the marble floor like dying leaves, and Linda Foster stood there with a triumphant smile on her face, completely unaware that she had just destroyed property belonging to the owner of her bank. The moment Linda Foster tore up my check, something shifted in the atmosphere of that bank lobby. The casual conversation stopped. The shuffling of papers ceased. Even the soft background music seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of my steady breathing and Linda's heavy panting from her outburst of rage. "You just destroyed my property," I said quietly, my voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from years of surgical training where emotions can mean the difference between life and death. "That was a legitimate financial instrument worth $50,000, and you have just committed a federal crime in front of dozens of witnesses." Linda Foster's laugh was harsh and ugly, echoing off the marble walls. "Federal crime. You're the one attempting fraud, identity theft, and money laundering." Marcus called the police immediately. I want this woman arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. As Marcus reached for his radio, the glass doors of Heritage Trust Bank opened with authority. William Hartford stepped inside, flanked by 2 corporate security officers in expensive suits. Hartford was exactly as I remembered him from our medical school days. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in positions of ultimate responsibility. The corporate security officers weren't local rent, cops like Marcus. These were serious professionals with military bearing and the kind of presence that immediately commanded respect from everyone in the room. The atmosphere changed instantly from chaotic hostility to tense anticipation. Linda Foster's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction as she saw Hartford approaching. In her twisted logic, she assumed he was there to support her actions and witness her triumph over what she believed was a criminal attempting to defraud her bank. "Mr. Hartford," she called out confidently, her chest puffed with pride. "Perfect timing, sir. We've just prevented a major money laundering operation. This woman tried to cash a fraudulent $50,000 check, made terrorist threats, and then assaulted me when I refused to process her illegal transaction." The lies flowed so easily from her lips that I realized this wasn't improvisation. This was a rehearsed script she had used before to justify her discriminatory actions. How many other innocent customers had been subjected to this same treatment? How many people had been falsely accused, humiliated, and driven away by Linda Foster's systematic racism? William Hartford surveyed the scene before him with growing horror. The torn check pieces scattered on the floor. The red mark on my cheek, where Linda had slapped me earlier. The hostile bank staff celebrating what they believed was their victory over a dangerous criminal. His expression darkened with each detail he absorbed. "Miss Foster," Hartford said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I need you to explain exactly what happened here, and I suggest you choose your words very carefully." Linda Foster straightened her jacket and launched into her fabricated version of events: how I had attempted to cash fraudulent checks, how I had made threats against bank personnel, how I had become violent when confronted with my crimes. Each lie built upon the previous one, creating an elaborate fiction that painted me as a dangerous criminal and her as a heroic defender of financial integrity. But what Linda Foster didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that William Hartford knew exactly who I was. He had been working with me for 6 months to plan this very moment. He had reviewed the documented evidence of discriminatory practices. He had seen the security footage of previous incidents. He knew that everything happening in this lobby was being recorded from multiple angles. As Linda finished her performance, Hartford opened his briefcase with deliberate ceremony. He pulled out a thick folder of official documents and spread them across the counter where my torn check had been moments before. "Miss Foster," he said in a voice that cut through the lobby like a surgeon's scalpel, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Amelia Richardson, majority shareholder and owner of 68% of Heritage Trust Bank." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The revelation hit the lobby like a shockwave. Linda Foster's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. Her face cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and then pure terror as the magnitude of what she had done sank in. The woman who had spent the morning assaulting, humiliating, and falsely accusing me was suddenly faced with the reality that I owned her job, her bank, and her future. Marcus Williams, the security guard who had been preparing to physically remove me just moments earlier, took several steps backward, his hands raised as if distance could somehow undo his participation in my harassment. The same hands that had been ready to forcibly drag me from the premises were now trembling with the realization of what he had almost done to his ultimate employer. Jessica Morgan, the teller who had started this entire confrontation with her theatrical examination of my legitimate check, was now staring at the ownership documents spread across her counter with a look of absolute horror. The cruel confidence she had displayed while mocking my credentials had evaporated, completely replaced by the pale-faced terror of someone who knew their career was over. "That's impossible," Linda Foster finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the stunned silence of the lobby. "You can't, there's no way." But the documents were authentic, official, and undeniable. My signature on the acquisition papers, the corporate seal, the board of directors' authorization, everything was legitimate and binding. William Hartford's voice cut through her stammering denials with clinical precision. "Doctor Richardson purchased controlling interest in Heritage Trust Bank 6 months ago through a series of carefully structured investments. The acquisition was completed legally and has been fully approved by all regulatory agencies. She is quite literally your boss. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted by the universe itself. The woman they had treated like a criminal, the person they had physically assaulted and attempted to have arrested, was the same person who now controlled their employment, their benefits, their professional futures. The racist employees who had spent years creating a toxic environment of discrimination were about to face the consequences of their actions in the most direct way possible. Linda Foster's legs seemed to give out slightly as she gripped the counter for support. "This isn't legal," she said, desperately grasping for any argument that might save her. "You can't just buy a bank to get revenge. There are regulations, procedures, oversight." But her protests sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time since the revelation, my voice calm and professional, "the acquisition was conducted entirely within legal parameters. The Federal Reserve reviewed and approved the transaction. The FDIC signed off on the ownership transfer. Every regulatory requirement was met or exceeded." The clinical precision of my words seemed to drain what little color remained from Linda Foster's face. The other customers in the lobby were pulling out phones to record this historic moment. Some were whispering frantically to each other, trying to process what they were witnessing. Others were shaking their heads in amazement at the dramatic reversal of power they had just observed. A few were actually applauding quietly, clearly pleased to see justice served after witnessing the discriminatory treatment I had endured. But I wasn't finished. The morning's events had provided me with exactly the evidence I needed to justify the comprehensive changes I was about to implement. "Miss Foster," I continued, "you are terminated immediately for creating a discriminatory work environment, for assault and battery against a customer, for destruction of customer property, and for filing false police reports. Security will escort you from the premises, and you can expect to hear from our legal department regarding both civil and criminal charges." The words hit her like physical blows. 23 years of employment, her entire career, her pension, her benefits, all gone in an instant because of her racist hatred. "You can't do this," she gasped, but we both knew she was wrong. I could, and I was. As corporate security escorted Linda Foster toward the exit, her legs barely supporting her weight, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep sadness for the waste of human potential that prejudice represents. This woman could have spent decades building bridges, serving her community, creating positive change. Instead, she had chosen hatred, and that choice had destroyed her. The systematic terminations continued as I cleaned house with surgical precision. Jessica Morgan, terminated for customer harassment and discriminatory practices. Marcus Williams, terminated and facing assault charges for his aggressive treatment of customers. Robert Chen and Margaret Thompson, terminated for participating in and enabling discriminatory behavior. Each dismissal was delivered with the same calm authority I used when making life or death decisions in the operating room. But transformation isn't just about removing toxic elements. It's about building something better in their place. I immediately called an emergency staff meeting for the remaining employees, those who had either opposed the discriminatory practices or had simply been too intimidated to speak up against Linda Foster's reign of prejudice. Maria Santos, a young teller who approached me nervously after the terminations, represented exactly the kind of employee I wanted to retain and promote. "Dr. Richardson," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I never agreed with how they treated customers. I tried to speak up once, but Miss Foster threatened to fire me if I ever questioned her methods again." Looking into Maria's sincere eyes, I saw the fear and relief of someone who had been forced to witness injustice without the power to stop it. "Thank you for speaking up now, Maria," I replied warmly. "Employees like you are exactly who we need to rebuild this institution properly. In fact, I'd like to offer you the position of Customer Advocacy Director. Your job will be to ensure that no customer ever again experiences what I went through today." The changes I implemented were immediate and comprehensive. Mandatory diversity training for all employees, community outreach programs designed to repair relationships with previously underserved populations, special loan programs for first-time homebuyers, small business owners, and students who had been systematically excluded from financial opportunities. But perhaps the most important change was symbolic. I walked over to the exact spot where Linda Foster had torn up my check, knelt down and carefully gathered every piece of the destroyed cashier's check. Standing back up, I held the fragments in my hands and addressed the gathered crowd of employees and customers. This torn check represented $50,000 that I planned to donate to our community clinic. I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the marble lobby. Linda Foster destroyed it because she couldn't believe that someone who looked like me deserved to have that kind of money. But hatred cannot destroy generosity, and prejudice cannot defeat purpose. I pulled out my phone and called my bank, arranging for an immediate wire transfer of $50,000 to the community clinic. Then I added another $50,000 from my personal account. $100,000. I announced to the applauding crowd, will now purchase medical equipment for patients who have been underserved by systems like this bank used to represent. As the weeks passed and the story of Heritage Trust Bank's transformation spread through the community, something beautiful began to happen. Elderly customers who had been previously turned away returned to open accounts. Young families who had been denied loans were approved for mortgages. Small business owners who had been humiliated found welcoming support for their entrepreneurial dreams. The toxic culture of discrimination was replaced by an environment of genuine service and community investment. Customer satisfaction ratings soared. Employee morale improved dramatically. Even our financial performance exceeded expectations as we tapped into previously ignored markets and built relationships with underserved communities. 6 months later, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from Mrs. Dorothy Washington, a 78-year-old woman who had banked at Heritage Trust for 40 years but had been increasingly mistreated as the discriminatory culture took hold. Dr. Richardson, she wrote, thank you for giving me back my dignity. Thank you for showing that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Thank you for proving that sometimes the universe has perfect timing. Standing in my office overlooking the lobby where this transformation began, I often think about the power of persistence, the importance of using privilege for purpose, and the reality that change requires both courage and resources. Linda Foster chose hatred and lost everything. I chose justice and gained a community. The question I ask myself, and that I pose to you now, is this: when faced with systematic injustice, do we accept it as unchangeable, or do we use whatever power we have to transform it? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you could do something meaningful about it? The tools for change exist. They just require the courage to use them. If this story resonates with you, if you've experienced similar treatment, or if you believe in the power of justice to transform communities, share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Black Stories Box for more stories of resilience, transformation, and the triumph of human dignity over prejudice. Because every ending is also a beginning, and every act of courage inspires others to find their own power to create change.